cases like this. Look at Chelsea Manning. The U.S. during her court-martial gave her credit time because she was in fact tortured. When you look at that kind of history, you could understand why this would happen. Amy, I want to give you the last word here. We've got a little over a minute and a half left now. Are you worried that this sets any kind of dangerous precedent, that it sends a message to journalists and others about the way they interact with sources? And walk us through what happens next.
Sure. So these charges, again, are not, he's not charged with leaking, he's not charged with the Espionage Act offenses, he's charged with a computer fraud crime. So it's different from some of the other cases that have been more controversial, in my opinion. What happens next is he will have a hearing in Westminster Magistrates Court on May 2nd, as I understand it. He had his hearing today on the bail jumping charge. The hearing on May 2nd will start to focus on the United States extradition request. And in my experience, having served at the embassy in London, these proceedings can take a very long time. So he will have a full opportunity to present all of these defenses. He can have an appeal. He can take an appeal to the European Court of Human Rights. And so this will take a long time to sort out. I think we won't see Julian Assange in the United States for months, if not years. And he may be able to launch a successful challenge. So it's going to unfold over a very long period of time.
Several months, if not years, then we'll be tracking it. Amy Jeffress, Jessalyn Radack, and Jamil Jaffer, thank you very much for your time.
Thank you.
We return now to the coup in Sudan, ending the 30-year rule of Omar al-Bashir. Sudan lies at the crossroads of sub-Saharan Africa, Northern Africa, and the Middle East. Its fate will have implications for international migration, counterterrorism, and regional stability. As Nick Schifrin reports now, protesters helped to end one reign of oppression, but they fear another could be on the way.
At the end of the largest peaceful demonstrations in a generation, at the end of 30 years of authoritarian rule, there was jubilation in the streets for the protesters who helped depose a despot. They held aloft the young soldier who sided with them against the regime. They pulled down Omar al-Bashir's face from ubiquitous posters, and they didn't care if they were sitting in traffic as long as they could declare V for victory. They expressed hope that today marked a new beginning.
We have been under his rule for 30 years and feel this step came too late. But what is important is that everyone is happy now.
Everyone will now work for a better united Sudan.
Since 1989, 75-year-old Omar al-Bashir forcibly united Sudan by waging wars while wearing a smile. In southern Sudan and Darfur, his militias scorched earth and massacred his enemies. Hundreds of thousands died and suffered from famine. He was indicted for war crimes, crimes against humanity, and genocide. And in the 1990s, he hosted Osama bin Laden. He led thanks to military support, but today the military removed him and promised a 2-year transition government administered by the military and declared by Defense Minister Awad Mohammed bin Auf.
We announce a complete ceasefire and the release of all prisoners immediately, providing an atmosphere for a peaceful transition of power, building political parties, holding free and fair elections by the end of the transitional period, and introducing a permanent constitution.
But for the hundreds of thousands who protested a regime and its military, that wasn't good enough. Immediately after the announcement, protesters surrounded an army general's vehicle and demanded a transition to democracy. They called Defense Minister Ibn Auf a regime crony. The U.S. still has sanctions against him.
It was a massive disappointment. People shouted in anger, "We do not accept this because they haven't done anything. No change, no real change."
Ma'awiyah Shaddad is a Khartoum professor and member of the Civil Society Alliance's forces that helped lead the protests. He says the demonstrations will continue until all their demands are met.
We need full democracy with all the principles and pillars of good governance. We want a representation of the people. We want to survive from the economic collapse. We also would like to ensure human rights, and also this should be done by a governing structure that is a truly civilian.
The demonstrations began in December as protests against increased food prices, but they quickly became political. They took over intersections and overpasses, chanting, "The people want to build a new Sudan, day and night." They drafted a nationalist message and demanded the man who himself took power in a military takeover finally cede power. Bashir has survived prior protests, but these were different. They peaked in Khartoum, the traditional base of his power. Protesters included opposition figures, working class, and the elite, including the children of regime members. And the majority were women. In an extremely patriarchal society, women helped lead the movement, and 22-year-old Ala Salah became its icon. She wore the uniform of working Sudanese women with touches of tradition, and where previous protests died out, female protesters provided staying power, especially as dozens of protesters were killed. Today, they are vowing to keep protesting. They say they may have won today's battle, but they're fighting a war that is far from over. And tonight in Sudan, protesters remain in the streets in defiance of a curfew that began at 10 p.m. local. For more, we turn to Khaled Madani, Associate Professor and Chair of the African Studies Department at McGill University in Montreal. Welcome to the NewsHour. The military is talking about a 2-year transition. Protesters say that's not enough. Are we on the road for continuing protests and a continuation of the regime just without Bashir?
Absolutely. I think there's no question we're on the way to continuing protest. I think this is essentially an internal coup, replacing one military leader with another. And of course, it's been very clear with respect to the position of the opposition that this is unacceptable. Their demand is very straightforward, very clear, and that is a transition to a civilian government that is overseen perhaps by the military, basically just as a kind of caretaker, but composed of a number of different technocrats and representatives of the different opposition groups, in addition to representatives of those who have taken to the streets over these 4 months. So the protest, as you probably have been looking at in terms of the news, will continue and will be sustained by the opposition. They've come out with statements, very strong statements today, saying that they will not tolerate this kind of continuation of the military regime, and they don't find the Military Transitional Council legitimate because their demand is not only to get rid of Bashir, which has been successful, of course, but also to really dismantle the regime. And of course, the acting head of state at the moment, the defense minister, is really just another member personnel of that regime.
So is the fear that the problems will persist? I mean, we're talking about now a divide between the military, the intelligence services, and the militias. We're talking about the economic crisis that sparked these protests. I mean, will today solve any of those problems at all?
No, absolutely not. I mean, that is really the central question. That is that the economic crisis is so deep. You have an inflation rate of over 60%. You have, of course, a great deal of unemployment. Basically, the economy is really under bankruptcy, which is really problematic. So the economic crisis cannot be resolved through military means. And the reason that this internal coup has happened and the reason that Bashir has been ousted basically is because of divisions within the military itself, in particular divisions and differences between the top brass of the military, including Howard ibn Auf, who currently, of course, is the head of government, and middle and lower ranking soldiers who've taken the side essentially with the protesters. And that really is the catalyst for why Bashir was ousted by his former loyalist and defense minister. And so the internal rift is the reason for this internal coup, but this is by no means going to solve the deep economic crisis and the grievances that have really propelled these protests, which of course are unprecedented in Sudanese history, since they're not only the largest protests across the country, across social groups, but also they're very sustained over 4 months. So they're basically the longest protests that we've seen in the history of Sudan. And the protests will in fact continue. Protesters at the moment are saying that they're going to continue their sit-ins in the hundreds of thousands until the real kind of regime falls, or a new transition to civilian government occurs.
Let's just quickly try and get through U.S. actions and interests here. Over the last few years with Sudan, the U.S. has been normalizing relations. In 2017, the U.S. lifted sanctions. Today, State Department released a statement calling for a, quote, speedy transition to a civilian-led government. Will the protesters consider that statement supportive of their demands?
Absolutely. I think that the statement that came out on April 9th that was released by the United States, Norway, and the United Kingdom, the Troika, was very positive with respect on the part of the protesters in terms of the support for a transition to democracy and rule of law. That is really important. It's very clear that the United States is sending signals that it's very, very interested and is in a democratic transition. So it's indirectly supporting the protesters. Of course, what the protesters and the opposition led by the Sudanese professional associations would like is increasing pressure by the United States and other Western allies towards the Bashir, to this present regime, in order to speed up the democratic process. What they're demanding very specifically at the moment is to negotiate with segments of the military to immediately have a civilian government or interim government that is manned by civilians to oversee a 4-year transition period to multi-party democracy.
Professor McCartney, we'll have to leave it there. Thank you so much.